Hi, everyone. Great to be here. Thank you, Kenneth and Wenley, for setting the stage. Basically, I want to build off what Wenley mentioned and give you 2 more case studies, but also kind of expand some of that baseline pre-implementation monitoring, what to expect, and also going a little bit into the adaptive management. This is the Sachuest Point project right here. You can see that's the GPS-guided dozer starting to spread some of the upland sediment we'll be talking about. And kind of my background, I work for Save the Bay, restoration ecologist. And my past life, I was formerly with refuges. And so that was my kind of introduction to this project was back in 2012. And then we really started in 2014 planning these projects. So I really feel really fortunate to be involved in kind of that initial scoping for these projects, the baseline data collection, the design and in-house working with the Nature Conservancy, and then also the implementation and doing a lot of construction oversight. So again, to really see kind of what goes well, what can go awry quickly if you're not on site, and then also getting into the post-restoration monitoring, and now we're still in the adaptive management phase, and now it's fun to be kind of writing up some of the research and starting to share the lessons learned with a lot of you folks. Awesome. So yeah, Sachuest Point, kind of the background for this site, municipal landfill until the mid-1970s, and so there had been a project about 20 years ago where there was a culvert replacement, water control structure put under the dune. And so when we went to permit this one, we actually got away with a Cat X. We didn't have to do a full EA for this, which was a time saver. It was about 10 or 11 acres. We brought in 11,000 cubic yards of upland sand, so it's different than the other 3 projects. We were going to use a lot of sand from a Aquidneck Island Rhode project, but that was delayed. So we actually ended up just trucking in a lot of material from a quarry in North Kingstown. And so it was a coarser upland sediment. And basically how it was spread was basically sand roads out into the marsh. But if you kind of think about it, this was a back barrier system. And so basically sediment placement was the term you'll hear me use a lot, or sediment enhancement. But basically this site had it's a back barrier. There was an old overwash event, and we basically were mimicking just when and where that takes place. And so right behind the dunes, we basically were spreading this. We call it the South Marsh, so you can kind of see that in the upper right photo there. And there were already some restoration units laid out from 10 years previous. That project, though, basically had resulted in basically 10 acres of low marsh. They didn't have that mosaic of habitats Wenley was mentioning. So one of our big goals was to create some like IVA areas, some high marsh areas. We did have 1 low marsh unit, and then we did leave areas of tide flat for all the shorebirds that come through and use this site. And yeah, that's the GPS-guided dozer there. So the contractor would actually tell me, I'm just squeezing a tennis ball in here, Ben. Like, I try to not override the controls. He basically would follow a CAD plan. And I'll get to that after, but it was really satisfying to just draw in GIS where we wanted the sand to go based on our baseline stuff. And then TNC could just export that as a CAD file. So it's really nice to have that control, and it really helped with construction oversight to have real. So here, just real quick, visual for all us visual learners. On the left, there's kind of the North Marsh, the Middle Marsh, and the South Marsh. The South Marsh is where it got sediment placement, and was basically dominated by low marsh previous. And one of the first steps in the baseline was coming up with names that wouldn't ever change. We had so many reports with different terms for this site. And then there, as you can see, right after the sand went down, how bare it is. But we're out here in 2023. We did a huge data push at all 4 sites, and things are really vegetating well here. And I'll get to a little bit of that. So just expanding a little bit about that site assessment, partners are just the best thing. Basically, all the different things we needed for our permitting, and then also just for designing the project. NRCS was critical on both the projects I'm covering for U.S. Fish and Wildlife today. And basically, they have the VibraCore specialized equipment. They came out to this site with VibraCore backpacks, and you could see all the old sand lenses in the back barrier system. So this is very much sand going over sand with a very narrow peat horizon. But, I don't know, we probably could have done this with remote sensing now, but basically I went out with the handheld Garmin and just walked everywhere to map the cover types, and then made some maps in GIS, and TNC cleaned it up and quantified it. We also did complete marsh-wide RTK surveys with surveyors, and we made a digital elevation model. There was another whole component to this project that I won't get into that was basically working with Woods Hole Group on 2 different hydrological studies, a 2D and a 3D modeling. We basically ended up rerouting the river that flows through this marsh. And so that digital elevation model is really important for that portion of things, not totally critically necessary for our sediment placement project. And as Wenley mentioned, we did come up with growing ranges in-house, so we felt very confident moving forward with those because we mapped not only Spartina padens and other high marsh species, but IVA, any little bits of frag on the site, and then we added about 10% for consolidation from a test we had done at Narrow River. Jumping to the other case study here on the John H. Chafee Refuge. This is the Narrow River project. Definitely an estuary-wide restoration. U.S. Fish and Wildlife was working with Land Trust and Audubon and other, you can see in this map on the right, and basically looking at the whole estuary. And so some areas were getting tidal hydrology restoration, and then experimentally, the refuge did a South Middlebridge unit in that island kind of in the middle, the Sedge Island, and those did get sand. And so you kind of see these, you've seen these before, if you know the impounded water signatures, the stunted alterna floor, and then starting even to become bare, and seeing that conversion of high marsh to low marsh. There was also a lot of edge calving here in the Narrow River. The refuge had tried for years to get a no-wake zone here, but basically you can kind of see on the right here, the boat channel is like right at the marsh. And so when boats are going by, there's a lot of calving off. The Narrow River, you could call it the shallow river. We got some guidance from our state dredge coordinator, and he really recommended, because it was so shallow, and also the units were small, he felt it'd be better to go with a novel vertical dredge, which is basically an excavator with a cutter head and suction. The one problem with that was there were delays getting that custom-made vertical dredge shipped from California to Rhode Island. There were also some issues. One of the benefits was that it was higher solids to water, but one of the downsides was you had more pipe clogging because that higher solids in there, and so that involved more equipment use on the marsh. We weren't expecting to go find those sections of pipe that had clogged. And if I was going to use the term thin layer placement, there were some units at Narrow River that did get that 4 to 6 inch range. We also had some areas that got up to like 8 inches for like an IVA target. We also had some low marsh elevation target areas offshore where historic marsh had been. And we also did some tidal flat on the back of the island to offset the tide flats we dredged. But it was about 20,000 cubic yards. And we did it in 2 phases because I know Kenneth was talking about dredge windows. Because of those construction delays, we actually ran out of time, so we came back into the last 1,000 cubic yards the second season. And so pre-restoration monitoring here, because this one was a dredge one, we did our cross-section profiles, estimating how much sand was in there. We did shellfish surveys. We did do cultural resources. We have the Rhode Island Refuge has a good relationship with the Narragansett tribe because of other projects they've done in Nirgurt Pond. And so we reached out to some of our contacts there for this project, and we actually brought them the soil cores and talked about, the 4-foot dredge cut we were proposing, if they felt comfortable with that. They also requested some science sonar into some of those sand flats to make sure there were no settlements or any kind of historical activity along the shore. But kind of the sand spar or sand spit we were dredging was more recent material that probably came off Narragansett Town Beach and had built up more in recent history. But it was good to have a good working relationship with them. And I think as Wenley mentioned, the mosaic of habitats. And you can kind of see here where Sedge Island was. It was kind of exciting to float a full-size excavator out to an island. Those growing ranges, it's really nice to graphically put it out as box plots. This was for another project. Wenley and I had done some growing range surveys. There is, as Wenley mentioned, that overlap between padens. The high end of padens and that low end of Phragmites, you can have some overlaps. You got to make some decisions there. But you also did eelgrass mapping on this project. It was basically just an in-house effort with U.S. Fish and Wildlife. The dredge cut had to be modified a little bit because we didn't want to go into some eelgrass beds. And you can kind of see the logistics for this one. It was interesting to hear about Kenneth talk about your 2 miles of pipe. We did not get that far. We had like 1,000-something feet was our longest pipe lay, but we basically stockpiled and dewatered, and a separate contractor spread it. Here's just a quick example of one of those low marsh creation areas. We used TNC partnered with local Rhode Island restaurants to recycle oyster shell, so it didn't go into landfills. So we recycled about 3,000 shell bags of those as for containment. And these have revegetated really well. They drain really well. And these are basically previous open water areas. So some of the challenges I alluded to at this site out of the 4 had some issues with compaction from that extra equipment passes to unclog those clogged pipes, and also the specifications for low ground pressure. There was some compaction that led to some hypersalinity that I'll get into. This was just a real quick, you don't have to memorize this, some of the metrics. And part of this was the big push we did with Dr. Kenny Raposa back in 2023 was, a lot of the core metrics were somewhat similar to the state project, but there were some gaps. So we tried to go back in 2023 and do hydrology, elevation, vegetation, but also adding in birds, avian surveys across all the sites. And so stay tuned for a write-up of all that, because that'll be some great lessons learned. And so just comparing side by side of these two, Sachuest, you can see that real jump in bear after initial placement, and then bear has steadily gone down to around 10% at that site. And you've seen a lot of high marsh testiculus and iva come in. The photos kind of match the graph. Narrow River has been a lot slower. This probably undercounts a little bit the revegetation. A lot of the growth here has been from the edges. A lot of those untreated, vegetated edges of each unit did a really good job for containment when you're pumping your sediment onto your site. And also the rhizomes have pushed into the sand and been able to colonize it very well. So that's kind of more of the incremental progress at this site. And this is the site I'll talk a little bit about adaptive management. Monitoring, we did go around and get how much elevation we added onto all these plots. I also just, whatever scale, I do think there's opportunity for smaller scale sediment placement projects. I think Kenneth, you did a smaller 3,000 cubic yard project. There was a section of Narrow River that was only 1,000 cubic yards that following winter. And we basically, those areas was kind of nice. We had a hand crew moving the pipe. And so basically, we just pump it into the grasses. We had grade stakes. And as soon as we were at about grade, we just moved to the next area every other day. And those areas, I'd say within 3 growing seasons, maybe less, just revegetated quite well with limited planting. And we do have pockets of high salinity at Narrow River due to that compaction. We're still studying it, but basically that transpiration, evaporation, leaving the salts behind. And so that's what we're going to get into with adaptive management. And a couple other lessons learned. We couldn't get a dredge contractor in time initially for the Narrow River project, so we were going to have to wait a whole nother year. So we said, why don't we get started by bringing in and doing like a test to see that consolidation factor. But the material brought in was upland material that had basically westerly granite, high iron content, so it created sulfides. Luckily, we only did 2 very small 50 by 80 plots. And so that was one lesson learned. Luckily, Sachuest was a different quarry, did not have those same issues. We tested for it. Also, phase planting. Sachuest, we put in, I forget if it was 20 or 30,000 plugs with Save the Bay. And basically, almost all of them survived and grew well. We fenced all of it because of the geese. Narrow River, opposite. We put in tens of thousands of plugs, and most of them did not survive, except for the higher elevation areas and the low marsh areas. The intermediate elevation struggled. Another lesson learned is just really being on site to do construction oversight so your SETs and monitoring equipment don't get run over, and so you get a product at the end with less touch-up. And adaptive management. So this site, once funds were running out, there were a couple of years where capacity was down. And then when we went back and started adaptive management in 2020, there was some low-hanging fruit of areas where the water was just trapped in the place sands. And you can see by the algal mats or visiting at different tide stages, but draining off that impounded water and even letting that edge growth get started was really key. You can see it's recolonizing. Obviously doing these different adaptive management things in conjunction with one another, using those dugout runnels to flush the sands and drain the water, building microtopography when suitable, when target elevations weren't reached. We also did additional saltwater acclimation of plugs before planting. And as Wendy mentioned as well, we had great success at the lower elevation areas to plant along drainage features. It created lower salinity flushed opportunities. For some areas, the hardest hit compacted ones, basically we had to do intentional compaction reduction. We tried with the rototiller getting down about 6 inches, but it didn't get the deep compaction. But Salicornia would come in with rototilled, but to really get the marsh grasses, we had to just physically dig it out. And then if you have really compacted and hypersalinity areas, we found you have to not only mechanically, with a shovel, decompact it, but you also have to buffer it, whether it's leaf compost, whether it's muck. You basically got to ensure proper drainage all around the plugs. And then they do survive. I think everyone we've spent the time to amend has survived. It's like night and day. And then a few we've actually also fenced as well. In conclusion, these are always estuary-wide projects. I think one of the big things we looked into in 23, though, was kind of filling in that avian use of these sites. Because, just not to be single species focused, but I know different tidal marsh birds at U.S. Fish and Wildlife and other agencies were always very interested if a species that could be extinct in a lifetime could get a lifeline from putting sediment placement onto a marsh. And we found at the 4 sites we did that each site did have benefits to salt marsh sparrows. Not only did they not upset the populations that were there, but we found that as the sands revegetated, the salt marsh sparrows pretty quickly moved on to use these sites. Even the sites like Narrow River that are still more than 50% bare, they're nesting on the edges. And so these last few slides are just highlights of that, kind of that nest Wenley was showing there. There's multiple nests at Ninigret now that we've documented successfully fledged. Quaney, the more recent one, also has this female that keeps returning each year to this one Payton's patch. She fledged last year, and then even someplace like Narrow River, you can see the bare areas in the background. The salt marsh sparrows are starting to use the edges where it's creeping in. I want to show that edge growth to you guys as well.